Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, good to see you today.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul.
Very good. We heard of a speech given over the weekend, a graduation speech by our Secretary of State, and he got big headlines, Drudge and a lot of other places, but mainly because of one small thing that he said in there, although he talked about a lot. It may have been small in the amount, but it was a big news item. Because the headline here on the Examiner says, Kerry slams Trump's wall, tells grads to prepare for borderless world. Well, that is a attention getter. That's a big issue. I think the Europeans know about what it might be like without borders and without national sovereignty. It's a big issue here, and they're talking about walls and all, but Kerry had some interesting things to say about this, and it invites questions as well, because I don't think that he came up with the right answer, quite frankly. But I guess you read or heard a little bit about this speech. Anything in it in particular that struck your attention?
Well, it's interesting how the media portrays the two as being the only two solutions. You either build a wall or you totally remove borders. But in Kerry's speech itself, it undermines what he says about a borderless world. He said there are no walls big enough to stop people from anywhere, tens of thousands of miles away, who are determined to take their own lives while they target others. So that, to me, would argue against a, quote, borderless world, because it would be obviously easier for them.
That's right, but I just wonder what his real goals are. And, you know, my first thought when I saw this and read a little bit about it was, wow, this is bold, because it didn't surprise me about his position and what the neocons are thinking and the New World Order and the one world government. They do want to obliterate borders. And libertarians generally go to the smallest unit of the government all the way back to the individual to provide safety and security and to take care of oneself. Then there's another group that's going in the opposite direction, that's one world government. So I saw it as being very bold, even though that isn't what he spent his time on. It was thrown out there to let the world know the neocons really don't believe in borders. I mean, he's not speaking for John Kerry. He's not even speaking just for the administration. He's speaking for the deep state, you know, the people behind government. And they're arguing this case. So I think this indicates that they feel like they're in the driver's seat. Quite frankly, I don't think they are, because they can't, unless they're doing this to counteract, trying to counteract Trump's idea that, well, the wall is going to solve the whole problem. I don't think it's going to be that easy. I think there's going to be a lot of conflict, and of course, we'd like to suggest that there will be an alternative.
What's interesting is just trying to view it objectively. It's amazing to me how the elites have such a tin ear when it comes to the masses of America. I mean, for better or for worse, Trump's idea is not necessarily something we would endorse, but he seems to have his finger on the pulse of what America thinks. Think about someone like Kerry. He married into the Heinz fortune. He's an extraordinarily wealthy man. He lives in a bubble. His border is his limo and his guards and his gated community. So it's, you know, it's sort of pushing it into the face of the rest of America that you all, you know, have to accept a world without borders, but I've got my own borders that my fortune provides for me.
And he probably has his little army there. There's somebody going to protect him with guns, you know, government guns, but he would just as soon take them away from independent citizens who would like to defend themselves. But, you know, on one side, fear is always a major factor in motivating, you know, politicians and getting people to support them. So the people who want walls are motivated by the fear of immigrants. Immigrants are bad people. They're coming in, and we have to build walls, and we have to exclude them. So it is the fear of immigrants. But Kerry comes along and says, well, you know, we have to be fearful of ISIS. You know, it's ISIS is the reason the problem. But he claims that one world government is going to take care of that and never addresses what happens. Like you indicated, he's totally inconsistent on this, on how he's going to solve the problem, and never says that maybe national sovereignty and individual sovereignty may be a much better way to go than national, international, and super one world government, which they continually work for.
You know, I happened to do immigration when I was on your staff in Congress, and I have to confess it was one of my least favorite topics because it's seemingly so intractable. There are such high emotions on both sides of the issue that it's hard to make a rational argument for kind of a third way. But you know, I would like to ask you, if you don't mind, we have the wall and we have the borderless world. What would a libertarian society look like when it comes to the issue of immigration?
Well, from my viewpoint, it's the only answer if they want to bring about decency. But there is a debate going on within the libertarian community, the Libertarian Party. Everybody debates this because there are some libertarians, and I think Napolitano actually has a pretty strong opinion about this, to have as open borders as possible, and some are very adamant. I mean, you ought to be able to leave, which I'd agree with that, but they're really open to allowing people to come in. And sometimes they might make the example, the United States is you know, a community of open borders, free trade, one currency, and it's worked out pretty well. But culturally, it was quite a bit different than, say, Europe. But I believe assimilation is good. There's nothing wrong with it. I think we should work for it. And assimilation of different religions and different cultures has worked over the ages, even in the Middle East and in Europe, and certainly in this country to a large degree. But the assimilation has to be based not on force and conditions that are artificially created by the government. It can't be, you know, in a welfare state where we promise, you know, benefits for people to come. We can't contribute to bad philosophies and bad conditions by interjecting ourselves into foreign lands in the Middle East, creating wars that create these immigrants and migrants to leave. So bad economic policy and migrants coming in and then subsidizing them and forcing them. Nobody for a minute, these people who argue the case for, well, you have to be culturally progressive, you have to help people, and they have this higher moral tone. But how many of them say, well, yes, I think we should do it, and the Kerrys and others in that category, do they say, you know, I have a big house, and I think I can take 20 immigrants in. You send them over, and I'll make sure we'll take care of them. I mean, it would be outrageous. Nobody would suggest that. But that's what they do. No. They come in and they put the burden on the middle class because it's deficit finance. We create these wars. We have the welfare state. Then we have low employments. We have people have a hard time making a living. And then they come in and put the burden and the disruption in the labor markets. That occurs too because it's not a market rate. But in a libertarian society, I think you would work for and be able to tolerate a lot of immigration. I think that obviously people should be able to leave a country anytime they want, and they ought to be able to take their wealth anytime they want. Right? In this country, we don't have that. But if people can come in, they have to be responsible for themselves. They can't invade somebody's private property. So if you have private property, and people who come and live, if the mixed cultures live together, they have to accept the libertarian principle, no acts of violence. You cannot create violence. You cannot initiate force. So if you have the libertarian principle and private property rights, all of a sudden the world is different. You wouldn't see thousands and tens of thousands, maybe 1 million people moving with the assumption, well, they believe in cultural Marxism. We have to take care of them. We'll tax the people. And besides, in this age, you don't need to tax the people for the total amount because you can always borrow the money. You can always print the money, and they go on and on, just compounding this mess. But I think in a libertarian society, it would be based on those people who own the land and not artificially dictated by politicians in Washington or any central government to tell them who can come and what not, and forcing people to pay their way. So I do believe, it would not be perfect, but believe me, building in a wall is pretty far out. I mean, just common sense tells you that Kerry's probably right. It's not going to solve the problem. The internal problems we have with false philosophy is a much bigger problem in our economy and all these things. So he's wrong with that. And but borderless countries indicating that there is no private property and it's all collectivism, and we are going to use force to force people to assimilate and put them in here, and it'll be forced integration, all these things. that leads to trouble, and I think it's only beginning. I think Europe is a powder keg, and hopefully we'll never get as bad off as the Europeans are. But I think it's a terrible thing. So I see Libertarian answer this much better, a much better way to go. But I think the Libertarians who argue, oh, we're for open borders, I think you need an explanation of what open borders are like in a libertarian society, because they're not that open. You can't just march in. It's sort of like the house example. I mean, a libertarian who owns a house, the guy down the street or the guy in the ghetto, they can't walk out and do it. That's collectivism. They did that. That's exactly what socialism and communism did. They take it and they assimilate by force. So it's the rejection of force and private property would go a long way to providing a libertarian answer to immigration.
And private property doesn't necessarily mean your house or your yard. It also means the currency that you deal in. So debasing the currency to provide a welfare state for immigrants is also an aggression against your private property. But I think that Kerry does have a point when he's attacking essentially Trump for the wall. It is true that there are not walls big enough to stop people who want to attack you. The problem is he doesn't see the other side of the coin, which is the foreign policy side. Then you must also adopt a foreign policy that makes it less likely that you are creating people who want to attack you. So that means an end to the drone wars, an end to remaking societies overseas, bombing and overthrowing and all of these NGOs and things. They don't see that part of it.
Well, I think both sides are guilty of that. I mean, the people who, the neocons, crack down on them, but there are others who don't look at the strong, foreign policy. So both the progressives and the neocons, are arguing the case that we have to take care of them. But why? Why do we have these problems? To me, so much of this boils down to philosophy, and I think the greatest distraction is political infighting, this political conflict going on. Oh, the Democrats are saying this and the Republicans are saying this. We have people arguing back and forth, and they rarely even talk or understand what the deep state is all about and why behind the scenes the momentum is always on the same way. So I think in many ways there's a deep state participant in what Kerry is saying, that there is an agenda, and sometimes it's not always motivated for financial benefits and financial reasons. It's because they think the world would be better off with collectivism for everybody else, of course, not for the ones who run the country. And they should be able to look, I think, more carefully at the philosophy of a country, and it's the philosophy of our welfare state and warfare state that has created the conditions that make it virtually impossible to expect an open way of more assimilation come in. You have to have the rules change and never use force and always respect private property. And under those conditions, I think that we would all be able to protect our own homes, just like John Kerry has his house protected by guns and special interests. Of course, we pay for his.
And that's why I think studying foreign policy and looking at foreign policy is so important, because you have these conditions that are created overseas that make us less safe at home and make it impossible really to have even a wall or a borderless state. So we have to look at the whole picture.
But I think if we moved in the direction of a libertarian society, there still would be borders, but they would be weaker. And there was a time, not too long, 100, 150 years ago, it was much easier to travel around the world. Before World War I, they said it was much easier to get into most countries without visas and different things. But when you have militant governments, it's a different story. I do want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. To me, this is a very interesting philosophic and political issue. Will the walls that Trump wants to build solve the problem of immigration, or will John Kerry solve the problems by saying that open borders is the solution to the problems that exist in the world? And of course, we'd like to suggest there is a libertarian option, and that emphasizes personal liberty, personal responsibility, property ownership, and no forced to make us pay for illegal immigration, and I think it would go a long way. Assimilation is possible. Although in a free libertarian society, nobody would have that as a policy, that you would have forced assimilation. Say assimilation of different cultures is a good idea. I think it is. But if you force it and use government money to do so, you just aggravate it and make it much worse. But there are so many places in history, in the Middle East and around the world, that assimilation has occurred when outsiders stay out of it and people live with respect for each other, even though their religious and cultural values are different. It's conceivable, but we have a long way to go to get people to understand what the non-aggression principle is all about and how important the civil liberty of owning property is in solving these problems. If we could recognize those 2 points, we'd go a long way to solving the problems that John Kerry is so misinformed on and that we are convinced that a wall is not going to solve. I want to thank everybody today for tuning into the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.